I walked into Bernardin expecting nothing more than a quiet dinner to celebrate my sister's promotion. But the hostess took one look at my discount store dress and said, "I'm sorry, but we don't accept walk-ins from people who clearly can't afford our prices." I didn't argue, didn't explain about the reservation. But when I reached into my worn purse for my phone to call my sister, my sleeve caught on the zipper, pulling back just enough to expose the small anchor tattoo on my wrist. That's when the Maître stopped dead in his tracks, his face going white as he stammered 4 words that silenced the entire dining room. "Admiral Brooks, your table's ready. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The morning had started like any other Thursday in my small apartment in Coronado. I was sipping coffee from a chipped mug, watching the sunrise paint the bay in shades of gold and pink, when my phone buzzed with a text from my sister Sarah. "Dinner tonight at Le Bernardin, 7 p.m. My treat. Finally got the partnership at the firm and I want to celebrate with my big sister." The message was followed by 3 champagne glass emojis and a heart. I stared at the text for a long moment, feeling that familiar knot of anxiety that came whenever Sarah wanted to do something that required me to be presentable in public. Le Bernardin wasn't just expensive, it was the kind of place where people went to be seen, where conversations happened in hushed tones over $100 bottles of wine, where the servers wore ties that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Sarah had been trying to get me out of my self-imposed isolation for months now. Ever since I'd retired from the Navy 3 years ago, I'd become something of a hermit, content to spend my days reading, taking long walks on the beach, and avoiding any situation that might require me to be anything other than invisible. My sister didn't understand it, couldn't grasp why someone who had once commanded respect from presidents and foreign ministers now preferred the anonymity of thrift store clothing and quiet evenings at home. I walked to my closet, such as it was, and surveyed my options. Everything I owned could fit into 2 small duffel bags, a habit I'd never broken from my years of deployment. My nicest dress was a navy blue number I'd bought at Target 2 years ago for a neighbor's funeral. It was simple, conservative, and showed no signs of the life I'd lived before. I paired it with black flats that had seen better days, and a small crossbody purse I'd picked up at a yard sale. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror, I looked like exactly what I'd worked so hard to become. Unremarkable. My graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, my face bare of makeup except for a touch of lip balm. The woman staring back at me bore no resemblance to the Admiral Brooks, who had once briefed congressional committees on national security matters, who had shaken hands with NATO commanders and received salutes from officers who would have followed her into any battle. That woman felt like a character from someone else's life now. I took the trolley downtown, watching San Diego's skyline grow larger through the scratched windows. The other passengers were a mix of tourists with their cameras and comfortable shoes, service members heading back to base after shore leave, and locals like me who used public transit because it was cheaper than parking downtown. No one looked at me twice, which was exactly how I preferred it. The thing about retiring from a life of command is that nobody teaches you how to be ordinary. For 30 years, every room I entered had reorganized itself around my presence. Conversations stopped when I approached. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the authority I carried like a uniform. People listened when I spoke, followed when I led, and trusted that the decisions I made came from a place of experience and wisdom earned through service to something larger than myself. Now I was just another middle-aged woman riding public transportation in discount clothing, and the anonymity was both liberating and devastating. Le Bernardin occupied the entire ground floor of the Pendry Hotel, its windows offering views of the harbor that had once been my domain. Through the glass I could see the elegant interior. Crisp white tablecloths, fresh flowers on every surface, and servers moving with the practiced grace of professional hospitality. It was the kind of place that existed in a different world from mine, where people discussed stock portfolios over appetizers that cost more than I spent on food in a week. I checked my phone. 6:55 p.m. Sarah had texted that she was running a few minutes late, stuck in traffic, coming from her law office in La Jolla. I decided to wait outside rather than go in early, not wanting to stand awkwardly in the lobby while better-dressed patrons streamed past me to their tables. The evening air carried the familiar scent of salt and seaweed, mixed with the exhaust from Harbor Drive and the distant sounds of military helicopters conducting training exercises over the bay. A group of young officers in dress whites walked past, heading toward the marina for what looked like an official function. Their pressed uniforms and polished shoes reminded me of a time when I'd worn similar attire, when every thread and crease had meaning, when respect was something I wore rather than something I hoped to earn. One of them caught my eye and nodded politely, the way people do when they're trying to be courteous to strangers. I nodded back, wondering if he could sense something familiar in my bearing, some remnant of the officer I'd once been. But he continued walking without a second glance, and I realized that whatever authority I'd once projected had been successfully buried beneath layers of deliberate ordinariness. At exactly 7 o'clock, I approached the restaurant's entrance. The hostess station was staffed by a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her black dress fitting her like it had been tailored specifically for her body. She looked up as I approached, her professional smile flickering slightly as she took in my appearance. "Good evening," I said, attempting the kind of confident tone I'd once used to address Joint Chiefs of Staff. "I have a reservation under Brooks for 7 o'clock. She consulted her tablet, scrolling through what I assumed was the evening's reservations. Her brow furrowed slightly, and she looked up at me again, this time with barely concealed skepticism. "I'm sorry, I don't see a Brooks reservation for this evening. Are you sure you have the right restaurant?" I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "My sister made the reservation. Sarah Brooks, she's an attorney. She should be here any minute." The hostess continued scrolling, her movements becoming more theatrical, as if she were making a great show of trying to help me despite the obvious mistake I'd made. Behind me, I could hear other patrons arriving, their conversations a mix of business deals and social plans that spoke of lives lived at a very different economic level from mine. "I'm not finding anything under Brooks," she said finally, her voice taking on the patronizing tone people use when they think they're dealing with someone who doesn't understand how things work. "Did you perhaps make a reservation at one of the other restaurants in the area? There's a lovely Applebee's about 10 minutes away that might be more." She paused, her eyes traveling over my outfit again. "More suitable." The word suitable hung in the air between us like a judgment. I felt something familiar stirring in my chest, a combination of anger and authority that I'd spent 3 years learning to suppress. In my former life, no one would have dared speak to me with such casual dismissal. But that was the point, wasn't it? I'd chosen this invisibility, worked for it, crafted it carefully as armor against a world that expected things from Admiral Brooks that the woman I'd become couldn't provide. "I'm certain the reservation is here," I said, my voice remaining level despite the frustration building inside me. "Perhaps you could check again or call your manager." The hostess sighed, the sound carrying all the exasperated patience of someone dealing with a difficult customer who clearly didn't belong in this establishment. "Ma'am, I've checked 3 times. We don't have any reservations under Brooks, and honestly, we're completely booked tonight. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside so I can help the other guests." I glanced over my shoulder and realized that a small line had formed behind me. A couple in matching designer outfits, the man checking his Rolex while the woman scrolled through her phone with manicured nails. Behind them, a group of 4 people whose clothes and bearing suggested they were visiting dignitaries or high-level business executives. They were all watching this interaction with the kind of detached interest people show when witnessing someone else's embarrassment. "Look," the hostess continued, lowering her voice, but not enough to prevent the other guests from hearing. "I understand you want to eat somewhere nice, but Le Bernardin has a certain standard. Our average entree is $45, and that's before wine or appetizers. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding about what kind of establishment this is." The couple behind me exchanged glances, and I heard the woman whisper something about people who didn't understand their place. The man nodded, checking his watch again with the impatience of someone whose time was valuable and was being wasted by watching a woman in discount clothing try to gain entry to a restaurant she clearly couldn't afford. I pulled out my phone to call Sarah, hoping she could clear up whatever confusion had led to this situation. But as I reached into my purse, the strap caught on something, and I had to tug it free. The motion pulled my sleeve back slightly, exposing about 2 inches of my left wrist, where a small but distinct tattoo was visible just below the sleeve line. It wasn't much to look at, really, just a simple black anchor, maybe an inch tall, with a rope twisted around its shaft. To most people, it would look like the kind of generic nautical tattoo that thousands of people got after spending time near the ocean. But to anyone who knew what to look for, it told a very specific story. The anchor design wasn't just any anchor. It was the exact specification used in the insignia of the Naval War College, with proportions and details that were standardized across all official Navy documentation. The rope pattern wasn't decorative. It followed the precise specifications outlined in Navy regulations for flag display protocols. And the placement, just below the wrist bone on the left arm, was exactly where tradition dictated that senior officers might place a small, discreet mark of their service. I barely noticed the exposure, focused as I was on dialing Sarah's number. But someone else did notice. Someone whose trained eye could recognize symbols that carried meaning beyond their simple appearance. "Excuse me," came a deep voice from somewhere behind the hostess station. "Is there some problem here?" I looked up to see a man approaching from the restaurant's interior. He was tall, probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested military service. His tuxedo was impeccably tailored, and he moved with the confident stride of someone who was clearly in charge of the establishment. This had to be the Maître, though his presence seemed to carry more authority than most restaurant managers possessed. "Mr. Davidson," the hostess said, relief evident in her voice. "This woman claims to have a reservation, but I can't find anything in our system." "I was just explaining that we might not be the right fit for her dining needs." Davidson's eyes moved from the hostess to me, taking in my appearance with the same swift assessment I'd received from the hostess. But then something changed in his expression. His gaze had dropped to my wrist, where the sleeve had pulled back just enough to reveal the anchor tattoo. I watched his face transform, color draining from his cheeks as recognition dawned. 25 years in the Navy had taught James Davidson to recognize symbols that others might miss. He'd served as an aide to 3 different admirals during his career, had spent countless hours in briefing rooms where the most senior officers in the Navy discussed matters of national security. He knew the traditions, the customs, the small markers that senior officers sometimes carried with them long after they'd left active duty. He knew that anchor tattoo wasn't just any anchor, and he was beginning to suspect that the woman standing in front of him wasn't just any customer. "Ma'am," he said, his voice suddenly formal, carrying a respect that hadn't been there moments before. "May I ask your name?" "Brooks," I replied, still focused on my phone as I waited for Sarah to answer. "I'm waiting for my sister. She should be here any minute to clear this up." Davidson went very still. In his years of service, he'd heard that name spoken in briefing rooms, had seen it on classified documents, had watched junior officers snap to attention when Admiral Brooks entered a room. The stories about Admiral Rebecca Brooks were legendary in Navy circles. The first woman to command a carrier strike group, the officer who'd negotiated the release of American hostages from Somalia, the strategist whose planning had prevented 3 separate international incidents from escalating to military conflict. According to official records, Admiral Brooks had retired 3 years ago after a distinguished 30-year career. The ceremony had been private, attended only by the highest levels of Navy leadership and select members of Congress. Since then, she'd vanished from public view so completely that most people assumed she'd moved somewhere far from San Diego, perhaps to spend her retirement in peaceful anonymity. But she was standing right here in his restaurant, being treated like someone who didn't belong. "Admiral Brooks?" he said quietly, the title carrying all the respect and recognition that had been missing from every interaction I'd had since walking through the door. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The hostess's mouth fell open, her professional composure cracking completely. The couple behind me stopped their whispered commentary, suddenly aware that they'd been witnessing something far more significant than a simple reservation mix-up. The group of business executives looked up from their phones, sensing that the dynamic in the room had shifted in a way they didn't understand but could feel. I looked up from my phone, meeting Davidson's eyes directly for the first time. In that moment, the careful anonymity I'd constructed fell away, and something of the officer I'd once been showed through. My posture straightened almost imperceptibly. My voice carried a note of authority that had been absent just moments before. "Just Brooks now," I said simply. "I've been retired for 3 years." But Davidson was already moving, his years of military protocol taking over. In one fluid motion, he stepped back and brought his right hand to his forehead in a crisp salute, his heels clicking together with the precision of someone who'd performed this gesture thousands of times before. "Admiral Brooks," he said, his voice carrying across the restaurant's entrance area. "Your table is ready." The silence that followed Davidson's salute stretched for what felt like an eternity. Every conversation in the entrance area had stopped mid-sentence. The hostess stood frozen behind her podium, her tablet forgotten in her hands as she stared at me with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The couple behind me had gone completely still, the woman's phone halfway to her ear as if she'd been about to make a call she would never complete. I felt that familiar weight settling back onto my shoulders, the invisible mantle of authority and expectation that I'd spent 3 years trying to shed. In Davidson's eyes, I could see the recognition of not just who I was, but who I had been. The officer who had testified before Congress about naval strategy in the South China Sea. The admiral who had coordinated joint operations with 7 different allied nations. The woman whose signature had appeared on classified documents that shaped American foreign policy. "At ease," I said quietly, and Davidson dropped his salute with the same precision he'd raised it. The words came automatically, muscle memory from 3 decades of command. But they felt strange in my mouth now, rusty from disuse. The hostess finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I had no idea." I turned to look at her. This young woman who moments before had been dismissing me as someone who didn't belong in her world. Her face had gone pale, and I could see her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her tablet. In her eyes was the dawning realization that she had just humiliated someone whose service record would have filled several filing cabinets, someone who had been trusted with decisions that affected thousands of lives. "How could you have known?" I asked, my voice gentle. There was no point in making her feel worse than she already did. "I dress like this specifically so people won't know." But my words didn't seem to comfort her. If anything, they made her look more stricken, as if the kindness was somehow worse than anger would have been. She looked desperately at Davidson, seeking guidance from someone who clearly understood the magnitude of her mistake better than she did. Davidson cleared his throat, his own composure professional, but tinged with something that looked like personal embarrassment. "Admiral, please allow me to escort you to your table personally. I believe your sister made a reservation under her first name, Sarah." I should have caught that immediately. As we began walking into the restaurant proper, I became aware of the ripple effect spreading through the dining room. Conversations that had been animated moments before were now conducted in hushed whispers. I caught fragments as we passed. "Did he just call her Admiral? Is that really?" I heard she testified before Congress. Didn't she win some big medal? The restaurant's interior was even more elegant than it had appeared from outside. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables dressed in pristine linens, each setting featuring more silverware than most people used in a week. The walls were adorned with maritime art, including several pieces that I recognized as depicting famous naval battles. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated the irony. Davidson led me toward a corner table with a view of the harbor, clearly one of the restaurant's premium locations. As we walked, I noticed other diners turning to watch our progress. Some looked curious. Others seemed to be trying to place where they might have seen my face before. A few appeared to be searching on their phones, probably trying to confirm their suspicions about who I might be. At a table near the windows, I spotted 2 men in expensive suits who had the bearing of military officers, even in civilian clothes. One of them was staring at me with the kind of focused attention that suggested recognition. As we passed their table, he leaned forward and said something urgent to his companion, who immediately turned to look at me as well. The second man's eyes widened slightly, and he started to rise from his chair as if he intended to approach me. I caught his eye and gave the slightest shake of my head, a gesture so small that anyone else would have missed it. But he understood immediately, settling back into his seat while maintaining the respectful posture of someone who had just been acknowledged by a superior officer. I realized then that this was exactly what I had been trying to avoid for 3 years. The recognition, the deference, the way rooms rearranged themselves around my presence. The careful anonymity I had constructed was crumbling with each step I took through this dining room, dissolved by a single salute and 2 words: Admiral Brooks. We reached the corner table, And Davidson pulled out my chair with the kind of formal courtesy that belonged in diplomatic circles rather than commercial restaurants. As I sat, I noticed that we were positioned with a clear view not just of the harbor but of most of the dining room. Whether intentional or not, it was the kind of strategic positioning that allowed for observation and quick exits, the sort of table that would naturally be selected for someone accustomed to thinking in terms of tactical advantages. "Your server this evening will be Marcus," Davidson said, straightening my napkin with unnecessary attention to detail. "He's our most experienced server, and I've taken the liberty of informing him that you are to receive our absolute finest service. Is there anything specific I can arrange for you while you wait for your sister?" I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on me, the kind of attention I had once taken for granted but had forgotten how to manage in civilian contexts. "Just water would be fine, thank you." Davidson nodded and stepped away, but I noticed he didn't go far. Instead, he positioned himself near the hostess station where he could maintain visual contact with my table while also managing the continuing stream of arriving guests. I suspected that word was already spreading through the restaurant staff, the kind of rapid communication network that existed in any well-run establishment when something out of the ordinary occurred. Within minutes, Marcus appeared at my table. He was probably in his 40s, with the polished professionalism that came from years of serving San Diego's elite. But there was something different in his approach, a formality that went beyond standard high-end restaurant service. "Good evening, Admiral," he said, placing a glass of water at my setting with the precision of someone performing a ceremony. "It's an honor to serve you this evening. I'm Marcus, and I'll be taking care of everything you need." The title felt strange coming from someone in civilian service, but I could see in his eyes that he meant it with genuine respect. "Thank you, Marcus. I'm waiting for my sister, so we'll hold off on ordering for now." "Of course. In the meantime, the chef has asked me to present a small appetizer selection, compliments of the house." He gestured, and another server appeared with a small plate of what looked like impossibly elegant canapes. "These are our specialties, prepared with ingredients flown in fresh from Maine this morning." I wanted to refuse to maintain the fiction that I was just another customer waiting for a dinner companion, but I could see that this wasn't really an offer so much as a gesture of respect, the kind of acknowledgement that institutions like this one made when they recognized someone whose service had earned special consideration. "That's very kind," I said, accepting the plate. "Please thank the chef for me." As Marcus retreated, I became aware of a new dynamic developing in the dining room. Other servers were finding excuses to pass by my table, some stealing glances, others offering small nods of acknowledgement. I heard one whisper to another, "That's her, the one from the news a few years ago, the hostage thing in Africa." The reference made me pause. The hostage thing had been a classified operation, one that hadn't appeared in any news reports beyond the basic acknowledgement that American civilians had been safely extracted from a deteriorating situation in Somalia. The details of how that extraction had been planned and executed were buried in classified files that would never see public light. Yet somehow, the story had leaked in fragments, creating a mythology around events that were far more complex and morally ambiguous than any public account could capture. I picked at one of the canapés, trying to ignore the growing murmur of conversation that seemed to center around my table. The food was exceptional, the kind of culinary artistry that justified the restaurant's reputation and prices. Under normal circumstances, I would have appreciated the skill and creativity that went into creating something so seemingly simple, yet clearly complex in its execution. But these weren't normal circumstances. I was beginning to feel like an exhibit in a museum, a curiosity that people could observe and discuss but not quite approach directly. The anonymity I had worked so hard to cultivate was dissolving more completely with each passing minute, replaced by the kind of attention that I had once wielded as a tool of command but now experienced as an unwelcome burden. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Running about 15 minutes late. Traffic is insane downtown. Hope you're already seated and enjoying some wine." I smiled at the message, imagining my sister's reaction when she walked into this situation. Sarah was proud of my military service, had been thrilled when I was promoted to flag rank, had even attended the change of command ceremony when I took over the carrier strike group. But she also understood better than most people why I had chosen retirement and anonymity, why I preferred target dresses to dress uniforms, why I had deliberately stepped away from a world where my opinions could start wars or prevent them. A new commotion near the entrance caught my attention. A group of 6 people had just arrived, clearly together, all dressed in the kind of clothes that suggested corporate success or political influence. They were being greeted by Davidson with the same professional courtesy he showed all guests, but I could see him glancing in my direction, as if weighing whether to mention that Admiral Brooks was dining in his establishment tonight. One member of the group, a woman with perfectly styled gray hair and a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, was speaking in the kind of carrying voice that suggested she was accustomed to being the center of attention in any room she entered. "We were hoping for the corner table with the harbor view," she was saying, gesturing toward where I was seated. "I specifically mentioned when I made the reservation that we needed the best table in the house. We're entertaining some very important investors from overseas, and the impression we make tonight could be worth millions to our firm." Davidson's response was too quiet for me to hear, but I could see him gesturing diplomatically toward other available tables, his body language suggesting that he was trying to accommodate their request while explaining why their preferred seating wasn't available. The woman's voice rose slightly, carrying more clearly across the dining room. "I don't understand. The table appears to be occupied by just one person. Surely you can move her to a smaller table and give us the seating we requested." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We're prepared to make it worth your while. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same reaction I'd always had to people who assumed that money or influence could rearrange reality to suit their preferences. In my former life, I had dealt with similar personalities in international negotiations. Corporate executives who believed that their economic power translated to authority in military matters. Politicians who thought that their positions entitled them to special treatment in operational decisions. Davidson's voice was still too quiet to hear clearly, but his posture had stiffened slightly. I could see him making the kind of careful diplomatic gestures that suggested he was trying to deflect the request without giving offense, while also protecting his current seating arrangement. The woman persisted, her tone becoming more imperious. "Look, I don't know who that woman is, but she's obviously dining alone, and she's taking up premium real estate that could be better utilized for our business dinner. Can't you simply explain that there's been a misunderstanding and relocate her?" That was when one of the men in her group, who had been standing slightly apart and looking around the dining room, suddenly went very still. His gaze had found me, and I could see recognition dawning on his face. He was probably in his 50s, with the kind of bearing that suggested military service, and his eyes had the focused quality that came from training in strategic assessment. He leaned over to the woman and said something in an urgent whisper. She looked annoyed at the interruption, brushing off his comment with an impatient gesture. But he persisted, speaking more insistently, and gradually the entire group's attention turned toward my table. I could see the moment when the woman realized that whatever her companion was telling her was significant. Her expression changed from irritation to curiosity, then to something that looked like concern as she took in my appearance more carefully. The man who had recognized me detached himself from the group and approached Davidson, speaking in low, respectful tones. I caught fragments of the conversation. "Didn't realize," and "honor to be in the same room," and "stories we heard in the service." Davidson nodded, his professional demeanor now mixed with something that looked like relief at having backup in managing this delicate situation. He gestured toward alternative seating arrangements, and I could see the group beginning to understand that their request to relocate me was not just impractical, but potentially embarrassing. The woman who had been so insistent about the corner table was now looking directly at me, her expression a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. I could almost see her mental calculations, trying to figure out who I was, and why her business companion seemed to consider my presence so significant. Meanwhile, other diners throughout the restaurant had begun to notice the drama playing out near the entrance. Conversations grew quieter as people strained to hear what was happening, and I could feel the collective attention of the room focusing on the intersection of my story with this new group's arrival. Marcus appeared at my elbow, his timing perfect as always. "Admiral, is everything all right? Can I get you anything while you wait for your sister?" His use of my title was quiet but distinct, and I saw several nearby diners react to it. The word Admiral carried weight in a city like San Diego, where military service was common and respected, but flag rank officers were rare enough to be noteworthy. "I'm fine, thank you," I replied, but even as I said it, I knew that the situation was moving beyond my control. The careful balance I had maintained for 3 years between anonymity and authenticity was tilting decisively toward revelation, pushed by forces I couldn't direct or contain. The woman from the group near the entrance had made a decision. She approached my table directly, her earlier imperious demeanor replaced by something that looked like genuine curiosity mixed with social uncertainty. "Excuse me," she said, her voice much quieter than it had been moments before. "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but my colleague tells me that you're someone I should know. I'm Patricia Chambers, and I think I may have made rather a fool of myself just now." I looked up at her, taking in the expensive clothes, the careful makeup, the general air of someone who was accustomed to being the most important person in most rooms she entered. But there was also something else in her expression now, a recognition that she had stumbled into a situation that required a different kind of social navigation than she was used to. "Just enjoying a quiet dinner," I said, keeping my voice neutral. No harm done. But Patricia Chambers wasn't ready to let it go. "Robert tells me you're Admiral Brooks. I have to admit, I'm not familiar with military ranks and protocols, but he seems to think that your service record is quite remarkable." I glanced toward the man she'd indicated, Robert, who was still standing near Davidson but watching our interaction with the focused attention of someone who understood the significance of what was happening. His bearing and the way he watched the room suggested intelligence work, possibly CIA or Defense Intelligence Agency, the kind of background that would have brought him into contact with senior military officers during his career. "I'm retired," I said simply, hoping to deflect further inquiry, but Patricia was clearly someone who was used to getting answers to her questions. "Robert mentioned something about hostages and international incidents. He seems to think that stories were written about your operations, though he says most of the details are classified." The reference to classified operations sent a small shock through me. Information about my service record wasn't supposed to be common knowledge, even among people with security clearances. The fact that someone at a business dinner was casually mentioning classified operations suggested that my story had spread further than I had realized, or that Patricia Chambers and her associates moved in circles where such information was more readily available than it should have been. "I'm sure Robert is exaggerating," I said, but I could see in her eyes that she wasn't buying the deflection. Around us, the restaurant continued to buzz with quiet conversations, but I was increasingly aware that many of those conversations were about me. The careful anonymity I had constructed over 3 years was collapsing more completely with each passing minute, dissolved by recognition that spread like ripples through the dining room. My phone buzzed again. Sarah letting me know she was finally parking and would be inside in just a couple of minutes. I felt a surge of relief at the prospect of having an ally in this increasingly complex social situation, someone who could help me navigate between the person I had been and the person I was trying to become. But as I looked around the dining room, taking in the watching faces and whispered conversations, I realized that my sister was about to walk into a situation that neither of us had anticipated when she'd suggested a quiet celebration dinner at an upscale restaurant. The Admiral Brooks, who had once commanded carrier strike groups, was being resurrected whether I wanted her to be or not. Sarah walked through the restaurant's entrance at exactly the moment when Patricia Chambers was leaning over my table, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby diners to hear her interrogation about classified operations and international incidents. My sister stopped just inside the doorway, taking in the scene with the sharp analytical eye that had made her one of San Diego's most successful corporate attorneys. Even from across the room, I could see Sarah processing the situation, her sister sitting at a premium corner table, surrounded by curious onlookers, with a well-dressed woman hovering over her, asking probing questions, while a Maître stood at respectful attention nearby. Sarah had seen me navigate complex social situations before, but this particular tableau was clearly unexpected. She approached with the confident stride that served her well in boardrooms and courthouses, her tailored navy suit and professional bearing marking her as someone who belonged in establishments like Le Bernardin. But as she got closer, I could see confusion growing in her expression as she took in the deference being shown to me by the restaurant staff and the intense attention I was receiving from other patrons. "Rebecca?" she said, reaching our table just as Patricia was asking another question about my service record. "I'm sorry I'm late. Traffic was absolutely insane coming from downtown." Patricia straightened, clearly recognizing that this was my dinner companion, but her curiosity about my background hadn't been satisfied by my deflections. "You must be the sister," she said, extending her hand to Sarah with practiced social ease. "I'm Patricia Chambers. I was just asking your sister about her remarkable military career." Sarah shook Patricia's hand, but her eyes were on me, trying to read the situation. "Military career?" she repeated, her voice carrying a note of protective caution that I recognized from her legal training. Sarah had spent years learning to navigate conversations where the wrong word could have serious consequences. "Robert tells me she's Admiral Brooks," Patricia continued, gesturing toward her companion who was still standing near the entrance with Davidson. "Apparently she's quite famous in military circles for some classified operations involving hostages and international incidents." I watched Sarah's face as she processed this information. My sister knew about my service, of course, had been proud of my achievements and supportive of my career, but she also understood why I had chosen retirement and anonymity. Why I dressed down and avoided situations that might lead to recognition or unwanted attention. She had never questioned my decision to step away from public life, but she had also never seen me in a situation where my carefully constructed privacy was being stripped away piece by piece. "I see," Sarah said carefully, settling into the chair that Marcus had quickly positioned for her. "Well, Rebecca has always been modest about her accomplishments, but Patricia wasn't ready to let the subject drop. Modest about preventing international wars?" she said, her voice rising slightly with excitement. "Robert says there are stories about her operations that would be front-page news if they weren't classified. He mentioned something about negotiating with terrorist leaders and coordinating rescue missions in hostile territory." I felt that familiar weight settling onto my shoulders again, the burden of a reputation that had followed me even into retirement. The stories Patricia was referencing weren't entirely accurate, but they weren't entirely wrong either. The problem with classified operations was that the vacuum of official information got filled by speculation and rumor, creating mythologies that were often more dramatic than the complex realities they were based on. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, a gesture of solidarity that I appreciated more than I could express. "My sister served her country with distinction," she said, her lawyer's training evident in the diplomatic phrasing, "but she's also entitled to privacy in her retirement." Of course," Patricia said quickly, but I could see she wasn't ready to abandon her inquiry. "It's just so fascinating to meet someone who's actually been involved in the kind of operations we only read about in novels." Robert was telling us about some mission in Somalia where she supposedly coordinated a multinational rescue operation under fire. The reference to Somalia sent a chill through me. That operation had been classified at levels that should have made it impossible for someone like Robert to know specific details, yet here he was apparently sharing information at a business dinner. Either classification protocols had been compromised somewhere along the chain, or Robert's background involved much higher security clearances than his current civilian position would suggest. I looked across the restaurant toward Robert, who was still engaged in quiet conversation with Davidson, but occasionally glancing in our direction. There was something about his bearing that suggested intelligence work, possibly at levels that would have brought him into contact with classified military operations. The fact that he recognized me and knew details about Somalia meant that my anonymity had been more fragile than I had realized. Sarah followed my gaze, her analytical mind clearly working through the implications of the situation. "Rebecca, would you prefer to continue this conversation somewhere more private?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of professional discretion that had made her successful in corporate law. Before I could answer, Robert himself approached our table, his movement purposeful but respectful. "Admiral Brooks," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough for nearby diners to hear. "I apologize for the interruption, but I wanted to introduce myself properly. Robert Chen, formerly with Defense Intelligence Agency, currently with Peterson Strategic Consulting." The mention of DIA explained how he knew about classified operations. But it also confirmed that information about my service record was circulating in intelligence circles despite official restrictions. I nodded acknowledgement, not wanting to be rude but also not encouraging further conversation. "I was stationed at CENTCOM during the Horn of Africa operations," Robert continued, his voice carrying the respectful tone that military personnel used when addressing senior officers. "I wrote intelligence assessments on several operations that you coordinated. Your tactical planning and diplomatic coordination saved dozens of American lives during some very complex situations." The restaurant had grown noticeably quieter around us, conversations dying as people strained to hear what was being said at our table. I could see servers pausing in their duties, pretending to adjust table settings while listening to Robert's comments. Other diners were no longer even pretending not to stare, their attention openly focused on what was clearly becoming a significant moment. That was a long time ago, I said, trying to deflect the growing attention while maintaining basic courtesy. I'm just enjoying a quiet dinner with my sister now. But Robert wasn't finished. Ma'am, with respect, what you accomplished in Somalia wasn't just another operation. When those aid workers were taken hostage and 3 different countries couldn't agree on a rescue approach, you developed a coordination strategy that allowed American, British, and French special operations teams to work together seamlessly. The hostages were recovered without a single casualty, and the entire operation was completed without triggering the regional conflict that everyone thought was inevitable. Sarah's hand tightened on mine, and I could see in her eyes that even she hadn't known the full scope of what had happened in Somalia. My sister knew I had been involved in classified operations, but the specific details of international coordination and hostage rescue were new information to her. Around us, the restaurant had gone completely silent. Every conversation had stopped, every piece of silverware had been set down, every phone call had been ended. The entire dining room was focused on Robert's account of operations that weren't supposed to exist in any public record. The intelligence reports called it the most successful multinational special operations coordination in modern history, Robert continued, his voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant. 3 hostile factions, 7 different government agencies, and international law complications that would have tied up most operations for months. But you found a way to cut through all of it and bring those people home. Patricia Chambers had gone very still, her earlier curiosity replaced by something that looked like genuine awe. You coordinated international military operations? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The weight of the entire restaurant's attention was becoming overwhelming. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, could sense the collective holding of breath as people waited to hear how I would respond to Robert's revelation. The anonymity I had carefully constructed over 3 years was completely gone now, dissolved by recognition that had spread through the dining room like wildfire. Marcus appeared at my elbow, his professional instincts telling him that the situation required intervention. Admiral, would you prefer a more private dining area? He asked quietly. We have a small private room that might be more comfortable for your dinner, but before I could answer, another voice joined the conversation from across the restaurant. Is that really Admiral Brooks? Called out a man from a table near the windows, his voice carrying clearly through the silence. The one who prevented the war in the Persian Gulf? The Persian Gulf reference was another classified operation, one that had been even more sensitive than Somalia, because it had involved preventing conflict rather than responding to it. The fact that someone in a civilian restaurant knew about it suggested that stories about my service record had spread far beyond intelligence circles. My God, said a woman at another table, her voice filled with recognition. You're the admiral who testified before Congress about China's naval expansion. I saw the footage on the news. You were the one who predicted exactly how they would respond to our Pacific strategy. The congressional testimony had been public, unlike the operational details, but it had been technical and focused on strategic analysis, rather than personal heroics. The fact that someone remembered it from news coverage suggested that my public profile had been higher than I had realized. Even during my active service, Sarah squeezed my hand, offering silent support as the situation continued to escalate beyond either of our expectations. I could see in her expression that she was proud of the recognition I was receiving, but also concerned about how I was handling the unwanted attention. Davidson approached our table with the smooth professionalism that had made him successful in high-end hospitality. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the restaurant, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew how to manage difficult situations. I'm sure Admiral Brooks would appreciate the opportunity to enjoy her dinner in peace. Perhaps we could allow her and her sister to continue their evening without further interruption. His intervention was well-intentioned, but it had the unintended effect of confirming my identity to anyone in the restaurant who might still have had doubts. The title Admiral Brooks now hung in the air like an official announcement, and I could see people throughout the dining room beginning to understand exactly who was sitting at the corner table. An elderly man at a table near the bar stood up slowly, his movement drawing attention from across the room. He was probably in his 70s, with a kind of bearing that suggested military service, and his eyes were fixed on me with unmistakable recognition. Admiral, he said, his voice strong despite his age. I served under your command during the Carrier Strike Group deployment to the South China Sea. Lieutenant Commander Wilson, USS Princeton. The name Wilson triggered a flood of memories from my time commanding the strike group. Frank Wilson had been one of my most reliable ship commanders, a steady and competent officer who had handled several complex situations with exceptional skill. I remembered recommending him for promotion and writing his fitness reports with genuine respect for his abilities. "Commander Wilson," I said, standing despite Sarah's gentle pressure on my hand trying to keep me seated. "It's good to see you." Wilson's face lit up with the kind of genuine pleasure that came from unexpected recognition from a former commanding officer. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say that serving under your command was the highlight of my naval career. The way you handled the situation with the Chinese destroyer escort, the diplomatic protocols you developed for international waters operations, the leadership you showed during that typhoon response, it was truly exceptional." His words carried across the silent restaurant, adding another layer to the growing picture of my service record. Other diners were beginning to understand that they were in the presence of someone whose military career had been far more significant than my modest appearance had suggested. But Wilson wasn't finished. "Ma'am, I don't know if you remember, but during the Taiwan Strait crisis, you were the one who developed the communication protocols that kept us from accidentally triggering a shooting war with the Chinese Navy. Your strategic thinking prevented what could have been a major international incident." The Taiwan Strait crisis had been another classified operation, one that had received minimal press coverage because successful prevention of conflict made for less dramatic news than actual fighting. But Wilson's reference to it confirmed that people throughout the military community knew about operations that weren't supposed to be public knowledge. Sarah stood beside me, her hand still on my arm, offering support as the situation continued to develop beyond our control. I could see in her expression that she was beginning to understand the full scope of what my military service had involved, the weight of responsibility I had carried, and the complexity of the operations I had coordinated. "Thank you, Commander," I said to Wilson, keeping my voice quiet in hopes of encouraging others not to join the conversation. "I hope retirement has been treating you well." But my attempt to deflect attention wasn't successful. A woman at a table near the entrance stood up, her movement confident and purposeful. She was probably in her 40s, with the kind of professional bearing that suggested government service or corporate leadership. "Admiral Brooks," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the restaurant. "I'm Sarah Martinez, currently with the State Department. I wanted to thank you personally for the briefings you provided during the Middle East crisis negotiations. Your strategic analysis and military insights were crucial to developing the diplomatic solutions that prevented what could have been a much larger conflict." The State Department reference added yet another dimension to the growing revelation of my service record. Martinez was confirming that my work had extended beyond purely military operations into diplomatic and international policy areas that most people would never associate with naval officers. I felt the weight of the entire restaurant's attention, the collective realization that they were witnessing something extraordinary. People were beginning to understand that the woman who had been dismissed as someone who couldn't afford fine dining was actually someone whose decisions had shaped international relations and prevented conflicts that could have affected millions of lives. Patricia Chambers, who had started this conversation out of social curiosity, was now staring at me with something approaching awe. "You've prevented multiple wars?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The question hung in the air, carrying with it the growing understanding of what my service record actually represented. Around the restaurant, I could see people beginning to process the magnitude of what they were hearing. The realization that they were in the presence of someone whose career had involved responsibilities that most people could barely imagine. Davidson stepped forward again, his professional instincts telling him that the situation needed to be managed before it got completely out of control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I think we can all agree that Admiral Brooks deserves our respect and gratitude for her service to our country. Perhaps we could show that respect by allowing her to enjoy her dinner in peace." His words carried the weight of genuine authority, and I could see people throughout the restaurant beginning to understand that continued interruption would be inappropriate. Conversations began to resume, though at much quieter levels than before, and the intense focus on my table started to dissipate. Sarah and I sat back down, and I could see in her eyes a mixture of pride and concern. "I had no idea," she said quietly, her voice carrying all the weight of discovering that her sister's military service had been far more significant than she had ever realized. "It was classified," I replied simply. "Most of it still is." Marcus appeared with menus and water glasses, his service now carrying the kind of formal respect that went beyond standard restaurant courtesy. "Admiral, Chef Martinez has prepared a special tasting menu for this evening, featuring dishes inspired by your global service. It would be his honor to prepare it for you and your sister. The offer was generous, but it also represented exactly the kind of special treatment that I had been trying to avoid for 3 years. I could see that turning it down would disappoint not just Marcus and the chef, but also Sarah, who was clearly moved by the recognition I was receiving. "That sounds wonderful," Sarah said before I could decline. "We'd be honored to try the chef's special menu." As Marcus retreated to place our order, I looked around the restaurant one final time. The intense attention had died down, but I could still feel the awareness of my presence, the subtle deference that came from people knowing they were sharing space with someone whose service record commanded respect. The hostess who had initially dismissed me was standing near her station, occasionally glancing in my direction, with an expression that mixed embarrassment with genuine remorse. Davidson was circulating among the tables, probably ensuring that other diners understood the importance of respecting my privacy for the remainder of the evening. "You know," Sarah said, reaching across the table to take my hand again, "I've always been proud of your service, but I never really understood what you accomplished. Hearing it from other people, seeing their reactions, it makes me realize how much you gave up when you retired." I squeezed her hand, grateful for her support, but also aware that this evening had fundamentally changed something about my carefully constructed anonymity. "I didn't give anything up," I said. "I chose a different kind of life, one where I could be just Rebecca instead of Admiral Brooks." But even as I said the words, I knew that the choice had been taken away from me. The recognition that had spread through this restaurant would follow me beyond these walls, carried by the dozens of people who now knew that the quietly dressed woman they had initially dismissed was actually someone whose service record included preventing wars and coordinating international operations. The Admiral Brooks, who had once commanded respect from presidents and foreign ministers, had been resurrected, whether I wanted her to be or not. The question now was how to live with both versions of myself: the public figure whose decisions had shaped history, and the private citizen who just wanted to enjoy dinner with her sister. As the first course of the chef's special tasting menu arrived, presented with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for visiting dignitaries, I realized that finding that balance would be the next challenge in a life that had been full of them. The quiet retirement I had crafted so carefully was over, replaced by something I wasn't sure I was ready to navigate. But as I looked across the table at Sarah, whose eyes shone with pride and love, I thought that maybe, just maybe, it would be possible to find a way to honor both the officer I had been and the woman I wanted to become. The chef's tasting menu arrived like a carefully orchestrated performance, each course presented with the kind of reverence usually reserved for state dinners. Chef Martinez himself emerged from the kitchen to present the final dish, a delicate preparation of Maine lobster that he explained had been inspired by my diplomatic work in international waters. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the plate before me, and I realized that word of my identity had spread through the entire restaurant staff with the efficiency of a military communication network. "Admiral, this dish represents the delicate balance of international cooperation," he said, his accent carrying the warmth of someone who had clearly immigrated to America and built a successful career through determination and skill. "The lobster from Maine, the truffle oil from France, the saffron from Spain, all working together in harmony, just like the nations you helped coordinate during your service." I was touched by the thoughtfulness behind the gesture, even as I felt overwhelmed by the continued attention. "Chef Martinez, this is beautiful. Thank you for taking such care with our meal." He beamed with pride, and I could see that my acknowledgement meant something significant to him. "My nephew served in the Navy, Admiral. He was deployed to the Mediterranean during one of the operations you coordinated. He came home safely because of the work you did. This meal is nothing compared to what you gave to families like ours." The personal connection caught me off guard. Throughout my career, I had been focused on strategic objectives and tactical outcomes, but the human cost and benefit of those decisions had often been abstract. Hearing from someone whose family had been directly affected by operations I had planned brought home the real-world impact of military service in a way that medals and commendations never could. Sarah watched this exchange with growing understanding of what my service had meant to people beyond just military circles. I could see in her expression that she was beginning to grasp why the recognition I had received tonight had been so overwhelming, why people had reacted with such genuine respect and gratitude. As Chef Martinez returned to the kitchen, the restaurant had settled into a different rhythm. The initial excitement of my recognition had faded into a more comfortable awareness, where other diners continued their own conversations while maintaining a respectful distance from our table. Occasionally, someone would catch my eye and nod politely. But the intense scrutiny had given way to a more manageable level of attention. "How do you feel about all this?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle but probing in the way that lawyers use when they want to understand the full scope of a situation. I considered the question carefully, tasting the expertly prepared lobster while trying to sort through the complex emotions that the evening had brought up. "Conflicted," I said finally. "For 3 years I've worked very hard to be invisible, to be just another person dealing with ordinary problems. Tonight reminded me why I made that choice, but it also reminded me of why I served in the first place." "The hostess was completely out of line," Sarah said, her protective instincts as a sister mixing with her professional outrage as an attorney. "The way she treated you was inexcusable, and it was based on assumptions that were not just wrong but fundamentally unfair." I nodded, remembering the dismissive tone and the suggestion that I couldn't afford to dine at Le Bernardin. She was doing her job as she understood it. The problem isn't that she made assumptions about me. The problem is that she made assumptions about anyone. Every person who walks through that door has a story, has value, has earned the right to be treated with basic dignity. "But still," Sarah pressed, "knowing what you've accomplished, knowing what you've sacrificed for this country, seeing you treated like that must have been infuriating." The word sacrificed hung between us, carrying weight that I wasn't sure I was ready to unpack. Sarah knew some of what military service had cost me, the relationships that hadn't survived long deployments, the physical wear from years of high-stress responsibility, the way that carrying classified secrets had created barriers between me and civilian life. But she didn't know about the nightmares that still woke me up some nights, the weight of decisions that had saved some lives while inevitably costing others, the way that success in military operations often meant accepting losses that would haunt you forever. "The treatment wasn't about me," I said, trying to find words for feelings that were still sorting themselves out. "It was about a system that judges people by their appearance, by their perceived economic status, by assumptions about what they deserve. That's a problem, whether the person being judged is a retired admiral or someone who really is struggling to pay their bills." Marcus appeared with wine pairings for each course, his service now carrying the kind of attention to detail that suggested the entire evening had become a special event in the restaurant's memory. "Compliments of our sommelier," he said, presenting a vintage that I recognized as prohibitively expensive for most diners. He selected wines that represent international cooperation, bottles from regions where your diplomatic work helped maintain peace. The gesture was generous, but it also represented exactly the kind of special treatment that would make it impossible for me to return to the anonymity I had cultivated. Word of this evening would spread beyond the restaurant, carried by the dozen or more people who had witnessed the revelation of my identity. Social media posts, conversations with friends, professional networks in military and government circles would all become vectors for information about where Admiral Brooks was living and how she could be found. "Marcus," I said gently, "this is all very thoughtful, but I hope you understand that I value my privacy very much. I'd appreciate it if what happened here tonight could remain as discreet as possible." His expression became immediately serious, and I could see him processing the request with professional understanding. "Of course, Admiral. I'll speak with the staff about maintaining confidentiality. We serve many high-profile guests, and discretion is part of our service." But even as he made the promise, I knew that controlling information was like trying to contain water with a net. Too many people had been involved. Too many connections had been made. Too many stories had been shared for this evening to remain truly private. The carefully constructed anonymity that had protected me for 3 years had been irreversibly compromised. Sarah seemed to understand my concern. "What will you do now? Will you move somewhere else? Start over again?" The question touched on fears I had been trying not to acknowledge throughout the evening. Moving would mean leaving behind the small community I had built in Coronado, the neighbors who knew me as just Rebecca, the routines and relationships that had helped me transition from military service to civilian life. It would mean starting over again, building new anonymity in a new place, always with the knowledge that recognition could shatter that privacy at any moment. "I don't know," I admitted. "For 3 years, I've been trying to figure out how to be a person instead of a position. Tonight showed me that maybe that's not entirely possible. Maybe there's no complete escape from who you've been, especially when who you've been has affected other people's lives." The conversation was interrupted by a gentle commotion near the restaurant's entrance. A group of young people, probably in their 20s, had just arrived and were being greeted by Davidson with his usual professional courtesy. But I could hear fragments of their conversation that suggested they weren't typical Le Bernardin customers. "We're not exactly dressed for fine dining," one of them was saying, gesturing to their casual clothes. "But we were hoping we could at least see the dining room. My grandmother told us stories about places like this, but we've never actually been inside one." Davidson's response was too quiet to hear clearly, but I could see him making welcoming gestures, apparently offering to show them the restaurant despite their concerns about their attire. The young woman who had spoken looked to be Latina, and her companions appeared to represent a mix of backgrounds that suggested they might be college students or recent graduates, exploring a world that had previously been outside their economic reach. "We saved up for months to try somewhere fancy," another member of the group was explaining. "It's my birthday, and my friends wanted to do something special, but I know we probably can't afford most of the menu." I watched Davidson's response with interest, remembering my own experience just hours earlier, when the hostess had made assumptions about my ability to afford the restaurant's prices. But Davidson's approach was completely different, focused on welcome rather than exclusion, on finding ways to accommodate rather than reasons to dismiss. "Every guest is welcome here," I heard him say clearly. "Let me see what we can arrange for a birthday celebration." The exchange reminded me of something important that had gotten lost in the evening's drama about my identity and service record. The real issue wasn't whether people recognized Admiral Brooks or treated her with appropriate respect. The real issue was whether every person who walked through these doors was treated with dignity and given the benefit of the doubt about their right to be there. "Excuse me for a moment," I said to Sarah, standing and walking toward the entrance where Davidson was still speaking with the young group. "Mr. Davidson," I said quietly, approaching him with a kind of respectful formality that wouldn't disrupt his conversation with the new guests. "I couldn't help but overhear. I'd like to cover their dinner tonight, if that would be appropriate." His eyes widened slightly, and I could see him processing the request in the context of everything that had happened that evening. "Admiral, that's very generous, but I'm sure we can arrange something within their budget." "I'm sure you can," I said, "but I'd like to do this. Consider it a birthday gift from someone who remembers what it felt like to save up for something special." The young woman who had mentioned saving for months had overheard our conversation, and her eyes went wide as she realized what was being offered. "Ma'am, we couldn't possibly accept that. We don't even know you." I turned to address her directly, struck by the dignity in her response despite the obvious financial pressure she was facing. "What's your name?" "Maria," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Maria Santos. This is my 22nd birthday, and my friends wanted to take me somewhere I'd never been before." "Happy birthday, Maria," I said, extending my hand to shake hers. "I'm Rebecca Brooks, and I think 22 is worth celebrating properly. Besides, I have a feeling you and your friends are exactly the kind of people this restaurant should be welcoming." Davidson had clearly made his decision about how to handle the situation. "Miss Santos, we'd be honored to host your birthday celebration. And Mrs. Brooks, thank you for your generosity. I'll make sure Chef Martinez prepares something special for the occasion." As Maria and her friends were escorted to their table, I caught fragments of their excited conversation about the unexpected turn their evening had taken. But I also noticed something else. Other diners in the restaurant were watching this interaction with interest, seeing that the woman who had been revealed as Admiral Brooks was using her influence not to demand special treatment for herself, but to ensure that others received the welcome they deserved. I returned to my table where Sarah was watching with the kind of proud smile that reminded me why family relationships were worth preserving despite the complications that public recognition could create. "That was beautifully done," she said as I sat back down. Very much like the sister I remember growing up with. The comment touched something deep in my chest, a recognition that the person I had been before military service and the person I was trying to become in retirement might not be as different as I had thought. "I spent 30 years making decisions that affected thousands of people," I said. "Maybe it's time to start making decisions that affect just a few people, but affect them directly and positively." Our conversation was interrupted by Marcus, who approached with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with personal concern. "Admiral, I apologize for the interruption, but there's a gentleman at the bar who says he's a reporter from the Union Tribune. He's asking if he might have a word with you." The mention of a reporter sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. Media attention was exactly what I had been trying to avoid for 3 years. The kind of public scrutiny that would make any return to anonymity impossible. Did he say what he wanted to discuss? He mentioned something about a story he's working on about military veterans transitioning to civilian life. He said he'd heard that you were dining here tonight and thought it might be a good opportunity for an interview. I looked across the restaurant toward the bar, where I could see a man in his 30s with a notebook, and the kind of alert expression that suggested journalistic training. He wasn't being aggressive or intrusive, but his presence represented a threshold that I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Sarah leaned forward, her legal instincts activated by the mention of media attention. You don't have to talk to him, Rebecca. You have every right to privacy, regardless of your service record. But as I considered the situation, I realized that the reporter's arrival might actually represent an opportunity rather than just a threat. Throughout the evening, I had been thinking about the problems with assumptions and judgments based on appearance, about the way people like Maria and her friends might be dismissed, while others received special treatment based on perceived status or economic position. Maybe I should talk to him, I said, surprising both Sarah and Marcus. Not about classified operations or strategic details, but about what happened here tonight. About the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of how they look or what assumptions we make about them. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the broader message I was considering. Should I tell him you'll speak with him? Give me a few minutes to finish dinner with my sister, I said. Then yes, I'll have a brief conversation. As Marcus retreated to deliver the message, Sarah studied my face with the analytical attention she brought to complex legal cases. Are you sure about this? Once you start talking to reporters, it becomes very difficult to control how the story gets told. I've been thinking about control all evening, I said, cutting into the perfectly prepared fish course that had arrived while we were managing the various interruptions. For 3 years, I've tried to control my public image by eliminating it entirely. But maybe that's not the right approach. Maybe the better approach is to control the message by being intentional about what story gets told. The fish was exceptional, prepared with the kind of technical skill that justified the restaurant's reputation. But I found myself thinking more about the evening's events than about the culinary artistry on my plate. The recognition I had received from other diners, the respect shown by former military colleagues, the deference from restaurant staff, all of it had reminded me of the privilege that came with rank and recognition. But it had also highlighted the absence of that respect for people who hadn't earned it through military service, people who deserve dignity simply by virtue of being human. What kind of message are you thinking about? Sarah asked, her legal training evident in the way she was helping me think through the implications of my decision. That service doesn't end with retirement, I said, the words forming as I spoke them, crystallizing thoughts that had been developing throughout the evening. That the skills and perspective you gain from military service can be used to advocate for people who don't have the benefit of rank or recognition. That respect and dignity should be universal, not dependent on achievement or status. The idea was taking shape as I spoke, moving from abstract concept to concrete possibility. For 3 years, I had been focused on escaping the responsibilities that came with public recognition. But maybe escape wasn't the right goal. Maybe the right goal was to use that recognition purposefully, to advocate for the kind of treatment that everyone deserved, regardless of their background or appearance. The reporter approached our table 20 minutes later, after Sarah and I had finished our main courses and were sharing a dessert that Chef Martinez had designed to represent the sweetness that comes from international cooperation. He was younger than I had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested genuine interest in storytelling rather than just sensationalism. Admiral Brooks, he said, extending his hand with respectful formality. I'm David Chen with the Union Tribune. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I understand you prefer your privacy, so I appreciate you taking the time. I gestured for him to join us at the table, noting that his approach was professional and courteous, rather than pushy or intrusive. What kind of story are you working on, Mr. Chen? I've been investigating how military veterans transition to civilian life, particularly senior officers who move from positions of significant responsibility to retirement. I was having dinner at the bar when I heard about what happened here tonight, and I thought it might illustrate some interesting points about how society treats veterans, especially those whose service records aren't immediately visible. His framing of the story suggested that he understood the broader issues involved beyond just the drama of recognition and revelation. What did you hear about what happened tonight? That you were initially dismissed by restaurant staff who made assumptions about your ability to afford dining here, and that the situation changed dramatically when your military service was recognized. It seems like a perfect example of how appearance-based judgments can lead to inappropriate treatment, and how military service gets respected only when it's known and acknowledged. I nodded, impressed by his understanding of the complex dynamics that had played out over the course of the evening. That's a fair assessment, but I'd like to broaden the conversation beyond just military service. What happened to me tonight happens to people every day, people who don't have the benefit of a service record that commands automatic respect. David pulled out his notebook, but I noticed that he asked permission before beginning to write. Can you elaborate on that? Earlier tonight, I watched a group of young people worry about whether they belonged in this restaurant because of their clothes and their budget. Their concern was legitimate, based on real experiences of being judged and dismissed. But everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their economic status or their appearance or their background. Military service shouldn't be a prerequisite for respect. Sarah nodded approvingly, recognizing that I was steering the conversation toward the broader social issues that the evening had highlighted, rather than focusing on my personal story or military achievements. So you see tonight's events as being about more than just recognition of your service record? David asked, his pen moving as he took notes. Absolutely. What happened to me was corrected, because people recognized who I had been. But what happens to people who don't have that kind of recognition to fall back on? What happens to Maria Santos and her friends when they save up for months to celebrate a birthday somewhere special? Do they get treated with dignity? Or do they get dismissed based on assumptions about what they can afford? David looked up from his notebook, clearly interested in the direction the conversation was taking. Are you suggesting that military veterans have a responsibility to advocate for broader social change? The question touched on something I had been thinking about throughout the evening. The way that privilege and recognition created opportunities for advocacy that shouldn't be wasted on personal comfort or convenience. I think people who have been given platforms, whether through military service or any other avenue, have a responsibility to use those platforms constructively. My rank and recognition open doors that are closed to other people. The question is what I do with that access. What do you plan to do? I looked around the restaurant, taking in the elegant surroundings, the attentive service, the other diners enjoying their meals in an atmosphere of comfort and privilege. Then I thought about the hostess who had initially dismissed me, the assumptions that had been made, the young people who had worried about their worthiness to be here. I'm not sure yet, I said honestly, but I think it starts with having conversations like this one, with talking about the way assumptions and judgments affect how people get treated, with using whatever influence I have to advocate for dignity and respect as universal rights rather than earned privileges. David nodded, continuing to take notes while maintaining eye contact in a way that suggested genuine engagement with the ideas rather than just collection of quotes. Do you think your military service gives you credibility to speak about these broader social issues? I think my military service gives me a platform, I said carefully. Whether it gives me credibility depends on what I do with that platform. Credibility comes from action, from consistency between values and behavior, from using privilege to lift up others rather than just to benefit yourself. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with David asking thoughtful questions about military transition, social responsibility, and the relationship between service and citizenship. But I was careful to keep the focus on broader themes rather than specific operational details, on social issues rather than personal biography. When he finished his questions and closed his notebook, David thanked me for my time and promised to send me a draft of the article before publication. This has been really valuable, he said. I think you've helped me understand that the story isn't just about military recognition, but about how we treat each other as human beings. As he left, I felt a sense of completion about the evening that surprised me. The recognition I had received, the attention I had attracted, the privacy I had lost. All of it felt less important than the opportunity to redirect the conversation toward issues that mattered beyond my personal comfort. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, Rebecca, not just for your military service, but for how you handled tonight. You turned what could have been just a story about yourself into something larger. I looked around the restaurant one final time, noting that Maria and her friends were laughing over dessert, that other diners had returned to their own conversations, that the evening had settled into a comfortable rhythm despite all the earlier drama. "I think I'm ready to go home now," I said. Davidson appeared at our table as if summoned, his professional instincts telling him that we were preparing to leave. "Admiral, it has been an honor having you dine with us tonight. I hope the evening met your expectations despite the unusual circumstances." "It exceeded them," I said sincerely. "Thank you for the way you handled everything, especially the way you welcomed Maria and her friends. That meant more to me than any special treatment I received." As we prepared to leave, I realized that the evening had fundamentally changed my relationship with my own identity. I couldn't return to complete anonymity, but I also couldn't embrace the kind of public recognition that would make normal life impossible. Instead, I would have to find a middle path, using the platform that recognition provided while protecting the privacy that made everyday life manageable. The hostess who had initially dismissed me approached as we walked toward the exit, her expression carrying genuine remorse mixed with professional embarrassment. "Admiral Brooks," she said quietly, "I want to apologize for earlier. I made assumptions that were completely inappropriate, and I'm sorry." I stopped and looked at her, seeing in her face the kind of genuine regret that suggested she had learned something from the experience. "Thank you for saying that. I hope tonight reminded all of us to be more thoughtful about the assumptions we make about people." She nodded, and I could see that she understood the broader lesson beyond just the specific mistake she had made with me. Sarah and I walked out into the San Diego evening, the harbor air carrying familiar scents of salt and seaweed mixed with the distant sounds of Navy helicopters conducting night training exercises. My car was parked in the same spot where I had left it hours earlier, but everything felt different now. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked as we reached my Honda. I considered the question, trying to sort through the complex mix of emotions that the evening had generated. "Like I've been reminded of who I am," I said finally. "Not just Admiral Brooks, but Rebecca Brooks. Someone who has the opportunity to make a difference, whether that's through military service or through advocating for the kind of world where everyone gets treated with dignity." The drive home took me along familiar streets, past the naval base where I had spent so many years, past the neighborhoods where I had built my quiet retirement life. But I was thinking about the future now, about how to balance privacy with responsibility, about how to use recognition as a tool for advocacy rather than just as a burden to be escaped. The phone call came the next morning while I was having coffee on my small patio, watching the sunrise paint the bay in shades of gold and pink. It was Davidson from Bernardin. "Admiral, I hope I'm not calling too early," he said, his voice carrying the same respectful formality he had shown the previous evening. "I wanted to let you know that we've received several calls this morning from other restaurants in the area, asking about our policies regarding dress codes and customer treatment. It seems that word about last night has spread, and people are asking questions about how establishments treat guests who might not fit traditional expectations." The news didn't surprise me, but it did suggest that the conversation David Chen and I had about broader social issues was already having an impact beyond just the article he would write. "That's interesting, Mr. Davidson. How are you planning to respond?" "We're reviewing our policies to make sure they focus on behavior and respect, rather than appearance or perceived economic status," he said. "Last night reminded us that every guest deserves dignity, regardless of how they look or what assumptions we might make about them." After ending the call, I sat in my garden thinking about the ripple effects that a single evening could generate. The recognition I had received at Bernardin had been uncomfortable and invasive, but it had also created opportunities for conversations that might not have happened otherwise. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Saw the Tribune article online. David Chen did a great job capturing what you were trying to say. Proud to be your sister." I pulled up the article on my phone and read through David's account of the previous evening. He had focused on the broader themes we had discussed, using my story as a framework for talking about assumptions, dignity, and the responsibility that comes with privilege. The headline read, "Admiral's Restaurant Experience Highlights Need for Universal Respect." The article was thoughtful and well-written, but more importantly, it was already generating discussion in the comments section and on social media. People were sharing their own experiences of being judged based on appearance, talking about the importance of treating everyone with dignity, questioning their own assumptions about who belonged in exclusive spaces. 3 months later, I received an invitation that surprised me. The San Diego Restaurant Association was hosting a conference on inclusive hospitality, and they wanted me to be the keynote speaker. The theme was Service Beyond the Menu, Creating Welcome for All Guests. Standing at the podium looking out at an audience of restaurant owners, managers, and hospitality professionals, I thought about the evening at Le Bernardin that had started this conversation. But I also thought about Maria Santos, who had kept in touch and was now working as a server at a downtown restaurant where she said the management treated every guest with respect, regardless of their appearance or budget. Service, I began, whether military or civilian, is about putting the needs of others before your own comfort or convenience. In restaurants, that means creating environments where every person who walks through your doors feels valued and welcome. In society, it means recognizing that dignity and respect should be universal rights, not earned privileges. The speech was well received, but more importantly, it led to concrete changes. Several restaurant chains revised their dress codes and customer service training. The city of San Diego launched a hospitality initiative focused on inclusive service. And Maria Santos started a nonprofit organization helping young people from underrepresented communities gain experience in the hospitality industry. 6 months after that night at Le Bernardin, I was no longer invisible in San Diego. People recognized me at the grocery store, at community events, in the coffee shop, where I had once been just another customer. But instead of feeling like a loss of privacy, it had become an opportunity for connection and advocacy. I still lived in my small apartment in Coronado, still shopped at Target, still preferred quiet evenings to social events. But I also used my platform to advocate for veterans' issues, to support inclusive policies in local businesses, and to speak about the importance of treating every person with dignity regardless of their background or appearance. The recognition that had terrified me for 3 years had become a tool for creating positive change, proof that service doesn't end with retirement but simply takes different forms. And every time I saw someone being treated with respect, despite not fitting traditional expectations, I thought about that evening at Le Bernardin and the unexpected ways that a single night could change everything. Admiral Brooks had been resurrected not as a burden to be carried, but as a platform to be used for something larger than myself. And Rebecca Brooks had learned that sometimes the best way to find peace with who you've been is to use that identity in service of who you want to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.